everybody, and welcome along to this edition of LiR Confidential with myself, Pat Parry, on LiR Media. We have an email for your comments as well, and they're all very much appreciated. It's info@lirmedia.tv. Press the red button on the right-hand side to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Very much appreciated. I'm delighted today in the studio, remotely speaking. We have to mention that. You never know what letters we might get after the show. They would be too close together. Mr. David Quinn, columnist with the Sunday Times and the Irish Catholic, and also head of the Iona Institute. Good evening, David, and welcome along to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Now, of course, you know, labels we put on people, sometimes like right wing, left wing, I think it's an excuse to try and sideline thinking and thought and all of that. That'd be my opinion anyway, David. But tell us a little bit first about the Iona Institute, because in this country, I know it's a small country, we do not have a tradition of what we call think tanks, you know, like they have, say, in Britain and other countries. So would the Iona Institute be a think tank in that respect?
Well, I suppose it's a kind of research and advocacy group. So we get very involved in debates about church and state, the various referendums that have taken place over the last few years about marriage and the right to life and so on, about denominational schools. And so we like to have a kind of input into those debates, do it in an informed way, have the facts and figures at our fingertips, provide those same facts and figures to other interested people. And that's where the kind of research and, if you like, think tank end comes into it. So the way we work is, like, we're a very small organization, so there's myself and two part-timers, but we have a kind of network of people that we might use who are in various kind of third level institutions, and yes, they would help us out on sort of areas of relevance to what we do.
So obviously, I mean, it as an institute and as the Iona Institute, it has made an impact. It's well known, you know, and that's a credit to yourselves. So how are we funded? I mean, it's on a shoestring like everything, like ourselves here in LiR Media. It's our own pocket most of the time. Funds the thing, you know, try and get it going. But anyway,
we have a database of maybe around 1,000 donors who are overwhelmingly members of the general public. They'd be mainly kind of mass-going people, as you'd expect, given the type of organisation we are. We're not exclusively Catholic, so there'd be people who are kind of from non-Catholic Christian backgrounds as well, who'd give donations. But we just do fundraisers among the general public, and we built up a database over time of loyal supporters.
I think most people, obviously, when it comes to religion or religion in education, for the want of a better word, it's always, I don't know how most people cannot have a debate on a rational, intellectual way without shouting down each other. And I think myself that religion or religious education schools, for the want of a better description, I think obviously the state abrogated its responsibility way back in history, if we want to look back at it, and left it to the Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland somewhat as well to get on with education. Now the wheels come around whereby a section of the community would prefer to have a choice in sending their kids to schools. And I think you and I would both agree, yes, choice is a good thing. Obviously now with the situation in Ireland as it is, the majority of national schools are Catholic schools. Now that's not a criticism, it's just a historical fact. That's the way it evolved. So how do you approach people? Do you say to them, or would we say to them, I'm talking about the state now itself, would they say to them, well, build your own school?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you go back, as you say, in history, not just in Ireland, but in a lot of countries with a kind of Christian heritage, the church in many countries would have founded an awful lot of schools. Mightn't just be the Catholic Church, might be Protestant churches too. And then the state comes along, and the state, to some extent, inherits those schools, sometimes takes them over, often continues to support them, and then builds its own schools as well. Because obviously as populations grow and education expands and free education expands, the state's involvement grows and grows and grows. But if you take a country like Britain, it's a very secular country, despite the fact that the monarch is also head of the Church of England. It's a very secular country in practice. And about a third of their public funded schools are church run, a combination of the Church of England and the Catholic Church mainly. People often think there's something really unusual in Ireland in that public funding of church schools takes place. It's not a bit unusual. America is one of the most unusual countries in the Western world in that it provides no money whatsoever to church schools. That's highly unusual. Even very secular France subsidizes Catholic schools out of public funds. What's unusual about Ireland is it's not the public funding of schools, of church-run schools, it's the sheer number that are church-run. So it's about 90% are run by the Catholic Church, and when you add in Protestant schools, it comes to well over 90%. So that's the unusual part of it. And over time, and everybody agrees, the number of church-run schools needs to decline, and the number of schools run by different type of bodies like Educate Together or the state itself needs to increase. And that's where the debate is mainly. But you have some people, and they want all public funding of church-run schools to come to an end because they think there's some unnatural thing to it. And their version of church-state separation means zero public funding for religious anything, schools, hospitals, whatever. And that's irrespective of what the public actually want. And that brings kind of secularism into a whole new sphere, and it's a kind of aggressive secularism. So we saw, and I know this is one of the ones you want to chat. I know this is one of the things you want to chat about. Iona Reardon, who's the Labour education spokesman, saying at the Labour Party conference last week that we've got to end all religious involvement in schools and hospitals. And then he said, let's get them out, which was an incredible thing to be saying. Because what he seems to be saying is because of the bad behaviour of some priests and nuns down the years in the various institutions, all Catholic parents who want Catholic schools are to be punished as a result. And not only Catholic parents, but also Protestant parents who want Protestant schools are also to become collateral damage of this generalized anger at the Catholic Church because of the misbehaviour and the scandalous behaviour of some priests and nuns.
Absolutely, and that's well said there. I mean, we're to be punished not alone for the sins of our fathers and grandfathers, but our great-grandfathers as well, according to the Oracle Aidan O'Riordan. Now, Aidan O'Riordan would do well to read the writings of James Connolly, who founded the Labour Party. And I don't think what his utterances at the conference would be in keeping with the principles enunciated by James Connolly if he took the time to read some of his writings. But that's Shin Scale Ella. But I think you're right, David. A lot of the argument is made by people. It's not a black and white issue because, I mean, as you said, 99.9% of the schools are well run. They're fantastic schools to go to, irrespective of whether your children are Catholic or non-Catholic. Because I notice myself, I live in Shannon here in County Clare, so I mean, an awful lot of parents opt to send their children, and that's the predominant issue in England, as you enunciated early on, that despite the fact that it's supposed to be highly secularized education, an awful lot of parents still, whether they're Catholic or not, people should remember that they opt to send their children to schools because they're well run and they have a fantastic record. I mean, really, it doesn't matter whether the person is wearing a white collar or a collar and tie that's teaching you, does it?
Well, I mean, in England, as you say, I think most church-run schools are oversubscribed, and parents vie to get their children in. Now, some of these parents are not really interested in a religious education per se for their children. What they want is a good education, but they know that religious schools will often provide a good education. So they try to live in areas which have a religious school in the neighbourhood. And I think if we were to eliminate the religious schools from Ireland, the education system as a whole would suffer. And in fact, when there has been attempts at divestment of church-run schools, that is the transfer of these schools to different patron bodies like Educate Together, there's often parental resistance. So a few years ago, I think it was 2019, so only 2 years ago, there were schools in North County Dublin, Portmarnock, Kinseely and Malahide. There was 8 Catholic schools in those areas, and the parents were asked, can you pick one of them to divest to another education body. And they said no. And you can be sure that most of those parents do not go to Mass, because this being, modern Ireland, most people whose children are of school age are not going to Mass. But they didn't want any of the schools being divested to a new patron body. Now, in fact, I'd probably have favoured that happening. But on the other hand, if they said to me, well, okay, it's one of the 8, it's going to be the school you're sending your children to, well, then I might be singing a different tune, because I mightn't want my particular school. No, it should be somebody else's school that gets divested. So when push comes to shove, even in an increasingly secular Ireland, there's resistance to divestment. They are comfortable with their local Catholic school. Now, in practice, as you probably know, most Catholic schools, it's kind of Catholicism light they're teaching. So they've kind of dialed down quite a lot on the Catholic doctrine that they might be teaching. They've moved over to a kind of more a comparative world religions kind of thing. They've made, Catholicism quite fuzzy around the edges. These parents, they don't mind their children being confirmed, making the first Holy Communion, the start of their life getting baptized. So they quite like the sacraments. They quite like these rites of passage to give them their name. They bring along their children to confession. They might never bring their children to confession again. They might rarely bring their children to Mass, but they still have some kind of a cultural Catholicism at work somewhere in the background.
That's very true, because, obviously, the Catholicism that I was taught going to national school way back in the late 50s, early 60s, has no bearing on what my kids went through in the school, indeed, and my grandkids now in that case. But I think myself, David, that I think human beings themselves, it doesn't matter what religion you are in my book. We're made up of both physical and spiritual beings. We cannot get away from that fact. It doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim, a Jew, a Roman Catholic, or whatever. I think, because as you said, you said it there, spot on. Parents recognize it without putting a name on it, that they want their kids to have this spiritual grounding without actually admitting it or saying it in public. They want this because, there are very few people now. You'd be ridiculed as a religious nut if you went on and said, well, I believe in keeping the 10 commandments, because they are the teachings of Christ. I follow the teachings in the New and Old Testament and all in the Bible. I believe in the Bible as the word of God. If you went around, you can't. What I'm trying to say is there isn't proper discourse today on those topics. The only time people are called in to discuss them, like yourself, I dare say, is when there's a controversy.
Yes.
Your phone will ring. David, can you come on? The panel, really.
Story of my life.
Yeah. And there you are. There's the token. I don't mean to be swearing.
I know what you mean.
There's a token Catholic over there, so we're covered, lads. Everyone else is on a different planet or a different footpath than you are. I think there has to be a really respect and understanding, because we have we have Muslim schools now in Dublin. We have, as you said, multi-denominational schools run by Educate Together. Just quite a lot of them, And I think this it's an organic process. I don't think you can impose ideology. You cannot impose ideology on people when they sit down. And as you said, the schools that were voted on, we pick a school in North County Dublin. When push came to shove, parents intrinsically recognize this is very important. Hold on a minute, dads. We need choice, but not my school. So I don't know, maybe some schools, the Bishop of Dud, the last bishop, is he still there? Archbishop Martin, is he retired?
No, Dermot Martin in Dublin is gone. Yeah, he's replaced by Dermot Farrell a little while ago.
Yeah, but I remember him saying that they had, I don't know, earmarked, I don't know how many schools in the Dublin area be divested. But as you said, it's a democratic process at the end. It has to be with the parents. And I know in Shannon we don't have any. There's one Church of Ireland, and all the others are Catholic schools in Shannon, national schools. I don't know whether there was a vote or not. I can't. My kids are gone now. Obviously, it wouldn't be that thing. But so the Iona Institute, David, yourself. Now the changes we said. People. I think people forget. For instance, during the abortion referendum, the abortion debate, I remember you being involved in that, you know. Now, people confuse that again, like another thing, like many other things, that it doesn't, because something is what's the word I'm looking for? Because there's a referendum held on a topic and it passes with a majority and it's written into the Constitution, it doesn't make it morally correct still. It makes it legal. And I think people confuse legality with spirituality. You know, what do you think?
Morality. Yeah. Morality. Well, yeah. So the Eighth Amendment, which is the pro-life amendment, as you say, in May 2018, gets repealed by a majority of 2-1. And so essentially, the likes of RTE has decided the issue is now settled. You're a minority of only 1 in 3, so it's goodbye and good night. And, you know, the fact that the majority support this means it must be right. All right, I think that's your point, that just because a majority support it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Because if you go back to 1983, when the Eighth Amendment was put into the Constitution, that was carried by a margin of 2-1. But there was no way RTE was thinking, well, okay, it's all over now. So the third of people who voted against the Eighth Amendment, because they thought it was a bad idea, some of them supporting abortion rights, as they put it, they weren't automatically in the wrong because they were in a majority of only a third. Okay, and they kept fighting. And back in 83, almost all of the media were against the Eighth Amendment. And they said, this isn't over. This is only beginning. And they pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until finally, of course, the thing gets repealed by 2-1. So it's a complete reversal of the 1983 result. But then lo and behold, unlike in 1983, they decided, because it's now been repealed by 2-1, it's all over. The debate's over. The debate is settled forever. The third who voted to keep the Eighth Amendment this time, they're not only in a minority, they're simply wrong, not to be heard from again. And so you'll find now that pro-life voices are almost absent from the airwaves, whereas pro-choice voices were far from absent from the airwaves after 1983. In fact, if anything, they became more present in the airwaves as part of a concerted campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment. So in a way, it's not whether the majority is on this side or that side that matters. It's whether you're on the side of fashionable opinion. And the 2/3 majority in favour of the Eighth Amendment in 83, that was unfashionable opinion. And this time, the 2/3 were on the side of fashionable opinion. And that's why it was, you know, such a big deal was made of it.
Yeah, and my special guest is David Quinn from the Iona Institute and columnist with the Sunday Times and the Irish Catholic. David, the abortion debate, to me, I was very, I wouldn't say upset now, that's the wrong word, but it never got off the ground because it was sidetracked into minutiae of detail. What about this person if they were in this position? Instead of having a proper, mature adult debate on the taking of life, it was sidetracked continuously by, oh, I know this person. And I'm not disparaging, I'm not making little of anybody's personal trauma. I'm just saying that it was down to an individual case, which was the exception rather than the rule, if you follow my drift. And so you were debating the exception for the whole bloody debate. And to me, it was very, very badly handled, you know, the debate itself, you know. In the media.
Well, yeah. Well, so as you say, over the years, support for the Eighth Amendment got chipped away by hard cases. So the X case, the C case, the D case, the Savita Halappanavar case, of course, as well. But about a week ago in Britain, a case came to court and it involved a woman who had died of sepsis after an abortion. And it's because of the abortion that she got sepsis. All right. So this, on paper, is the opposite of the tragic Savita Halappanavar case.
Yeah.
But whereas the Savita Halappanavar case got huge headlines, including in outside of Ireland, this case of this woman in Britain who died of blood poisoning following an abortion, almost nobody has heard of this. In fact, I only learned of it a couple of days ago. I would say you can nearly count on the fingers of one hand the number of people in the country, or even in Britain, who have heard of this case. And it's not the first case, by the way, of a woman who has died of sepsis poisoning following an abortion. But these hard cases for the abortion side never get publicized because they don't suit the agenda. And I mean, there's other cases of, women dying post-abortion. There's cases of late-term abortions. There's cases of women being kind of forced by boyfriends to have abortions against their will, or by parents to have abortions against their will. Yeah. None of this ever gets publicized. So it's only the hard cases for the pro-life side get publicized, and then this has a decisive change in public opinion. But the hard changes for the pro-choice side never get publicized. I mean, in fact, within no time at all after the passage, after the repeal of the 8th Amendment and the passage of the new abortion law, which was January 2019, within just a few weeks of that, there was a horrible case in Hollis Street, the maternity hospital, the biggest in the country, of a couple who were told, your baby's going to die. This is your unborn baby is going to die. And so they felt kind of rushed into having an abortion. And then it was discovered after the abortion, the child was perfectly healthy. All right. And of course, imagine the pain that couple felt.
I remember that.
This case got some publicity, but not much. Okay. So this was, yeah.
And the whole abortion thing, David, as you well know, you'll be more au fait with this than me. In the United States, in many states now, they're beginning to roll back. I don't mean to roll, roll back. Unfortunate word today, but they're beginning to roll back and reduce. I mean, there are many states in America that allow full-term abortions. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, look, there are no words for that in my book. There are no words for that. You know, there's one, but we cannot. I wouldn't use it now in the interview. It's shocking that is allowed. It's just appalling. I can't comprehend it myself. You know, as I said, I mean, you look today in society today with the whole COVID thing. The other disappointing thing for me, I know you're in the spot now. You're only one person, but was the bishops closing the churches. I mean, that to me, I thought I'd never see it.
Yeah. Well, let me just, I'll come on to that, but I mean, I'll just backtrack a little bit and make a point that's still relevant to COVID. So the whole purpose of the lockdowns and all the restrictions has been to save life, to save people from dying of COVID, which is a natural disease. But paradoxically, at the same time, we're making it easier to deliberately kill human beings at both ends of life. So we've already allowed for determination of unborn human life in the womb, all right, which is obviously, deliberate killing. I mean, no matter how you look at it, even if you're pro-choice, you're obviously killing an unborn human being, whatever rights you may think it has, through a deliberate choice. And now they're moving toward, to legalize assisted suicide, which allows for the deliberate killing of the old and infirm. So we have this happening, and then paradoxically, we're moving might and main to prevent people dying of a natural disease like COVID. Now, this is, by the way, I'm in favor of some restrictions. I was in favor of the first lockdown, but it is a paradoxical thing that we're moving such a mighty amount, as I say, to slow down the course of a natural disease at the same time as making it easier and easier to kill people at both ends of life. So that's a kind of paradoxical thing, I think, worth noting. Now, in respect of restrictions, so if you wind back to February, March of last year, when European countries began to introduce restrictions, it was common to stop public worship back then. But as time went on, most countries actually permitted public worship, even when they went into new lockdowns. Yeah, we were an exception. In the second and third lockdowns, we just completely closed public worship. We banned it for everybody. And in fact, we criminalized it at one point. No other country I'm aware of in Europe did this. The only country that came close to Ireland in terms of basically preventing people going to Mass and other forms of public worship was Slovakia. England, after the first lockdown, the various religious leaders wrote to Boris Johnson and basically said, don't do this again. There's no evidence that churches were responsible for outbreaks of COVID. And because they were being very well run and very safely run. Yes. But here in this country, they were very, very quick to do it. And there was very little resistance from the churches, unfortunately, unlike in other countries. Like again, in France, you had bishops taking cases. You had lay people taking cases. In Scotland, you had Christians taking cases, and they would usually win these cases because the courts would usually decide banning public worship like this, you haven't done it with sufficient evidence. you haven't shown us the evidence that there's a sufficient public health reason to do this, because the churches have proven they can run themselves safely. Limit the numbers coming in, social distancing, sterilizing your hands, wearing masks. They were doing it safely, but they still closed them here.
Yeah, but as you know yourself, I mean, all churches, I would say this without fear of favor, all churches, first of all, when you go in the door of any church, not aware in the rural or city or town, big, huge, high ceilings, you know, you need 2-3 scaffoldings to reach up to them, plenty air circulating, plenty space. I thought they should have utterly ignored them after the second or third lockdown and throw the doors open, because you don't get a huge crowd going in on a daily basis to most churches. Unfortunately, that's a fact of life. And the people who found solace and some kind of peace there were mainly my vintage and older, you know. And so that's who went to mass during the week, Monday to Friday, you know. That's who I'd see going anyway, regularly around the place. So, I mean, really, that was completely denied them. And I dare say it caused an awful lot of depression, loneliness, and hopelessness for that vulnerable community, you know, in my book, you know. And I think they're a bit remiss now in not biting the bullet earlier on, because we spoke, my colleague Mary, who met there, she spoke to many priests up and down the country, you know. And there was a few that decided to bite the bullet themselves, as you know, and celebrate Mass, you know. And the edifice of the Gardaí walking onto the altar during Mass, to me, in the church up in the Midlands, was a new low in this republic.
Yeah, it was stunning. I mean, to my mind, after the first lockdown, the bishop should have joined with Declan Ganley, you know, the businessman, former politician who took a case, constitutional case, which still hasn't been heard, by the way.
They won't hear it either.
No. But anyway, he was trying to fight for his rights as a Catholic to go to Mass, and he wanted all the evidence to be brought to light and to show that churches were safe places to be, so long as they were properly run, which they were being. And for the court to decide, well, on balance, there's no good reason to stop public worship, and that was unconstitutional to do so. So it's a mystery to me to this day why not just the Catholic Church, but the other religions didn't join in as well in that case. They can still join it. I mean, the case still hasn't been heard. And we could be facing into another lockdown again, by the way, as we all know. And they might stop us going into churches again. This is possible. Now, if that's the case, they really should join Declan Ganley's case. And they should take the example of their overseas counterparts. But at the absolute minimum, they should do what religious leaders in England did when Boris Johnson was moving to ban public worship again under the second lockdown, which actually he did temporarily, but then lifted it when there was this pushback. So you had Protestant church leaders, Catholic church leaders, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, etc., all joining together, and they put together this very well-reasoned letter, sent it off to Boris, and Boris and co. eventually relented and said, you can open them. So it just baffles me why something similar to that didn't happen here. I mean, what could be easier than to do that?
You're dead right. You live in Dublin, don't you, David?
Yeah.
Can you imagine, like, you couldn't go into a Catholic church, but hundreds and thousands upon thousands could go into every supermarket up and down Dublin, you know? Every supermarket on a daily basis could go in every single day throughout the whole crisis, every day, and they couldn't go into a Catholic church.
Well, I went to quite a lot of the NEFIT press conferences in the early months, and September of last year when we began to move into, so Dublin and Donegal and a couple of other counties were moved into a lockdown again in September, and then the rest of the country from early October. So I remember going into one of those press conferences, and I said, look, what's the justification for this? And where's the evidence that this will do any good? And they had no evidence. But what they said was, so I was pointing out, as we were moving, like, remember there was these various levels of lockdown, and there was tiers 1 to 5 or thereabouts. And I think under level 3, you could still go to gyms and hairdressers, but you couldn't go to Mass. And I think we might have been at that stage of lockdown in Dublin, where you could still go to gyms, you could still go to the hairdresser and what have you, barbers, but you couldn't go to Mass. So I was putting this to them. And they said, so the answer I got back was, well, in the context of a pandemic, we close down things considered less important. So what they meant by that is we're keeping open things that are considered economically important. So the barber and the gym are money making, keep people in employment, whereas churches don't. So they're considered less important. So it's all about actually at that point, the economy. And so the spiritual and moral and psychological importance of keeping churches open simply didn't rate. And I just thought that was very telling. We were the only country doing that at this point. So it just showed where we were in the government and the public health authorities' orders of priority. And it was in a very low place indeed.
I know, and I lost my own mum at the end of last year.
Right.
During the thing, and the shocking thing to me was the church, not allowing people in. And I never forget it, And well, my dad is still not around, thank God. But I'm just saying it was not because she was my mother. She deserved better.
Yeah, of course.
She deserved a better send off, in my opinion, But that's history. Unfortunately, that's history,
Yeah.
So
Well, it might be. Well, we never know what's going to happen again shortly, though, do we? To start restricting numbers again.
To me now, today in society, it's very worrying. It's still extremely worrying when people are throwing around this medical apartheid practice, which is suggested by these COVID certs, when there's no empirical evidence whatsoever that it does anything for the virus. Why are we accepting that?
Well, my own position, I'm vaccinated. I got vaccinated as soon as I could. My thinking is that the risk, any associated risk with the vaccines is lower than the risk of getting the disease. I've heard of a number of unvaccinated people who have become very seriously ill. I know of one fellow, actually, he's kind of a friend of a friend who's in ICU right now. He's only in his early 30s, really seriously ill. So that was one argument in favor of taking the vaccine, that the risks, any risk of side effects of the vaccines are lower than the risk of you getting COVID if you're unvaccinated. So that was one. Another one is I didn't want to be transmitting it to people if I got it. Now, of course, we discover you can transmit even when you're vaccinated, which we weren't really aware of a few months ago. So that takes away one of the arguments. So anyway, so I'm double vaccinated. I'm pro-vaccine, but I'm also against the COVID passports, the COVID passes to get in places. I think they're probably counterproductive. I think if you're unvaccinated, particularly if you're a young person and you can't go to the pub, you're going to have parties in your houses instead. And you're probably at more risk of getting COVID that way. In England, they have no vaccine passports. And I think in the north, they might be getting around to it, but for most places, they don't. And at the moment, England's COVID rate is lower than ours. And they have a lower vaccination rate too. They have way more boosters out than we do. In Sweden, they have no COVID passes. They have a much lower rate than us of COVID right now. Now, this thing, it's very unpredictable. It comes in waves. It goes up, it goes down. It goes up, it goes down. It's very hard to put the waves down to any one thing. But we've had COVID passes for weeks and the rates keep on going up. And again, like what they said now is nightclubs and all late night places must close at midnight. So if you're a young person, you've been in the pub and it's coming around to 11:30 and you're thinking, we can't go to a nightclub, where are we going to go? Or should we go back to somebody's house? All right. And that's what a lot of them will do. Or they'll say, well, they have freedom up north. So we go up north. So I'd say they'll begin to see people like they did. So the north lifted this lockdown before we did. People began to go north, young people in particular. I was on a train to Belfast shortly after the north opened up. I was going up there to do some work. It was absolutely packed with young people because they couldn't go into pubs and nightclubs here, or pubs. So up they went, up into the north, and they were hiring, Airbnb and this sort of stuff.
A lot of people I know went up there, And I suppose last Saturday in Lansdowne Road, they had the 51,000 people, and the Thursday before 1,000 people. Next Sunday, there'll be 51,000 people. They won't be wearing masks. We don't know whether they'll be vaccinated or not. And yet you want a pass to go in to get a meal. It makes no sense to me, David. Well,
it's at least 93% of adults are now fully vaccinated. And they don't add in the people who have also had COVID. Because there's these COVID recovery certificates you can get if you've had COVID, and that will also allow you into places. So 500,000 people have had COVID now, at least. It has to be more. because not every COVID case gets reported. But let's take the 500,000 who have had COVID, and we know it. Now, a lot of them are also double vaccinated, but it could be 250,000 who have had COVID, haven't got double vaccinated, see no need. So actually, the percentage of people who have either had COVID or are double vaccinated must be a good bit higher than 93%. So in other words, it's nearly everybody. So the argument in favor of the vaccine passport diminishes all the time. We're about, in terms of COVID, for the foreseeable future, we're about as safe as we're going to be. It's not as safe as we'd like, but as a society, we've kind of forgotten that life involves a certain amount of risk. And the amount of risk because of COVID is now greater than it. So the amount of risk because of COVID is now greater than it was. And we don't seem to be prepared to live with that, even with the vaccines. And so we're moving more and more again, unfortunately, towards lockdown. I hope it doesn't happen, but it looks like we're moving closer. And you see, at some point, the government is going to conclude, well, even if we close the pubs, well, then there's a worry people will simply start meeting in their houses more, where nobody's keeping them socially distanced. And then they begin to think, well, we got to stop them meeting in their houses. So we got to go to full lockdown. So even with vaccinations, it's possible.
You're right. And it'll be shambolic if we go to a full lockdown. I think we're reaching the point, and I think we've reached the point long ago when we have to get on with living with it. And I think the government that will decide that will get some kudos, I think, from the generality of the population. There's no doubt in my mind. We can't continue. We're social beings. We're not solitary beings. We're social beings to interact with each other. We're not meant to be created to live in splendid isolation. We have the odd dervish, as I say, in history, but I'm just saying that we're not expected to live like that. And so therefore, they have to make a decision in my book. And this idea of having a minister coming out and a teacher coming out, and NPHET and the chief medical officer are not elected to govern us in any shape or form. They should not be on the media any day of the week. They're there to advise the government, and the only one speaking to the media should be the government spokesperson, I think myself. I mean, I think RTE have done a huge disservice, speaking out one of them, to the generality of people, of scaring the bejesus out of them, you know, with these figures. Just shocking, carry on, David.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take some of the NPHET figures and the NPHET modelling, they've often been very badly wrong. They were modelling the number of cases up to the end of September a few months ago, and even their most optimistic scenario proved to be wrong. We ended up with a lower number of cases than even their most optimistic scenario. And then now they produce new figures, and those new figures again seem to be too pessimistic. But they never seem to suffer any real criticism for getting their figures so badly wrong. And so the result is that there's a lot of unnecessary fear created. But if somebody comes along and they might be underestimating the virus a bit, their reputations get crushed. So there seems to be only a price to be paid reputationally if you underestimate the virus. There seems to be no price to be paid if you overestimate it, even if you overestimate it incredibly badly. Like there was headlines going back to March of last year, and I kept one of these papers on purpose for the sake of posterity. We could have 85,000 dead. Now, 85,000 dead here is the equivalent of millions upon millions in the United States. And that was never going to happen. So the 85,000, I even knew at the time, this is grossly exaggerated. But the people who came up with those sort of figures have suffered no reputational damage at all. And so it means an excess of fear is being created. And to see another thing as well is we're always thinking, or at least a lot of people think, well, isn't it better to be safe than sorry? So we go into lockdown for a fourth time. But they never seem to think there's a cost to lockdown. And of course, the cost of lockdown is lots of kids suffering educationally, suffering emotionally, people losing their livelihoods, people who cocoon sometimes unnecessarily, and their general health deteriorates because doctors are reporting a lot of their elderly patients they haven't seen in a very long time that they've got frailer. All right. And also, I mean, what way is it to live? To live in fear all the time and to live, kind of basically walled up in your house all the time. But I feel like I have two children under 20 and 23, and I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, I don't want you giving up your freedom indefinitely for my sake.
Yeah.
Because I think that's unfair on you as young people who want to get on with your lives. And young people love to socialize. I mean, like when you get to a certain age and you get settled, it's easier not to go out into the world all the time. I mean, you still want to do it, but you don't tend to socialize as much as young people, because young people are still trying to make new friends.
Yes.
They want to go to university, or they want to go to school, and they want to socialize at weekends. And we can do less of that because we've already found our partners and all that kind of thing. And so I think it's
they're trying to live. And when you said, David, there that there was no consequences for people who made those 85, I remember those 85,000 deaths. I'm not surprised, because politicians, even at the highest level, tell lies in the Dáil, tell lies on television, tell lies on a radio interview. I'm not going to mention anyone in this program for obvious reasons. And yet, there's no consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have a semi-cynical view of politicians. I mean, it's a horrible job now to go into. Because of the whole 24/7 news cycle, and because of social media, you can be attacked 24/7. And you can now have people protesting outside your house. So I think it's increasingly a thankless job where you're subject only to criticism. So I don't like to kind of overdo it. I don't know how many kind of consciously lie, but they will certainly say what suits them. All right. And they will kind of selectively pick from facts. And they will selectively pick projections about COVID that suit lockdown. All right. And that's gone on wholesale, and kind of an over concentration on those who might say, an over criticism of those who might say we're going too far, because they're accused of, oh, well, you're going to be responsible for X number of deaths. All right. If you're critical of lockdown. But again, it can't be repeated often enough. Ireland had longer lockdowns than anywhere else in the whole of Europe. Now, they'll turn around and they'll say, well, we've had fewer deaths. Well, compared with who? We've had fewer deaths per head of population than Britain, but Britain is a very different country. It's much more densely populated. Its population is older. So you've got to compare Ireland with other geographically peripheral, sparsely populated countries, like we say Norway and Finland. And Norway and Finland had fewer restrictions for most of this, and they also have fewer deaths. So have we done such a fantastic job, in fact? And then take Sweden. Sweden has had about an average number of deaths in European terms, but they've had no lockdown, ever. They've had restrictions, and quite a lot of them, but never had lockdown. On any day of the week, right through this entire thing, you can go into a pub in Sweden or into a restaurant in Sweden in limited numbers. And their death toll, if you take into account population, it's twice ours. And if you take into account the age of their population, they're a lot older than us on average. Their death rate is actually only slightly higher than here.
And what about countries, say in Africa, I know we won't get too bogged down, who have no injection program?
Well, they have a much younger population in those countries, and I think that's obviously a huge help. And they don't fully understand this disease yet. So does it affect certain groups apart from by age worse than others? And they don't fully know that either. I mean, this thing is still full of mystery. But it is amazing to me. You see, I'm sure they're not recording cases properly in Africa, because it depends on, have you got enough money in your health system to properly record cases? And a lot of these countries are poor and probably don't. But at the end of the day, if people were piling up outside hospitals, you'd see it. All right. So it's actually, I would have thought there'd be more deaths in Africa than there have been. There's been a lot, but fewer than I think most people would have predicted. And they probably don't fully know the answer to this yet, to be honest.
No, they don't. The weather has some, maybe the sunshine is better.
Possibly, I don't know. Yeah. People can meet outside much more.
Yeah, yes, there might be more daylight. Look, I don't really know the variables. As you said, we're not virologists or anything like that, but I was speaking to people from Zambia and people from Congo, and really, some of them, one person didn't hear of this virus till she landed in London after flying from Zambia.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were in a village So they didn't hear about this virus till she landed in London. Suddenly, I mean.
Well, you see, in poor countries, you can't afford to go into lockdown because it literally may mean at the end of the day, you don't put food on your table. I mean, if this had hit Ireland 100 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to afford to go into lockdown.
No.
Full stop. And in fact, if you go back 100 years, there was no vaccinations and no antibiotics. And so people had to live with far more risk in their lives. If people 100 years ago had the same attitude to risk that we do now, we'd never have gone outside the front door. I mean, think of all the things children died from.
Yeah.
We'd have wrapped our children in cotton wool, never let them out to play. Okay.
No.
But at the end of the day, people know you can't live like that. So again, you've got to be prepared to live with a certain amount of calculated risk. And I think
how many times were we taught as children in my generation, go off out, you know, they don't want to see you till supper time.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, how many times did you say that to your children? I don't think ever.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think, again, we've become extremely risk averse. And so we tend to wrap our children in cotton wool and, drive them to play dates, bring them back from the play dates. And the idea of leaving them for hours on the street playing among themselves is just unheard of now. Whereas our mother said out the door, as you say.
And being a Catholic today now, David, in Ireland, obviously there has been changes. And we all know the history. There's no point in going over old grounds. I'm not dismissing it as a non-event, in case people might think so. I'm just saying, for yourself personally now, living the life as a Catholic today, there are different challenges. But, I mean, are you still proud to be a Catholic?
Well, I mean, you can't. It's, given the scandals. I mean, I've been writing for newspapers since 1994, and the period I began writing nearly exactly coincided with the scandals coming to public light, and so a lot of my first years in journalism were spent commenting on this stuff. So it's very hard when you know all about those scandals to say I'm a proud Catholic, all right? Because unfortunately, you do have to wear the sackcloth and ashes a bit because of them, and you see what was done. But I mean, I'm still a practicing, believing Catholic. I mean, my point has always been, even if 99% of the world was a hypocrite, it gives you no excuse to be one as well. All right. And if you had a bad father, it doesn't give you an excuse to be a bad father. If you were a bad mother, it doesn't give you an excuse to be a bad mother. It doesn't mean you give up on the idea of motherhood. And it doesn't mean you give up on the idea of fatherhood. All right. Or, I mean, you see, human nature can be a bit disappointing, can't it? I mean, history is riddled with the terrible things we have done to each other in every name. So in the name of religion, in the name of politics, in the name of love. Okay, the number of crimes committed in the name of love is also legion. In the name of money. So unfortunately, we find all kinds of reasons to do terrible things to each other. And you look back at history and you find this. And history is a catalogue of terrible crimes. And then you think, so do we give up on human nature? All right. And the answer is we don't. We try to make ourselves better and make our societies better. And at the end of the day, it is extremely difficult to think of a better model for life than Jesus Christ. And that remains the bottom line. And as, Jesus says to Peter at one point in the gospel, will you too leave me now? And Peter says to Jesus, well, where else would we go? You have the words of eternal life. And that's as true now as it ever was. So no matter what priests or religious or Catholic lay people may do, I'm talking about the bad things, there is still nothing better than the gospel. And that remains as true today as it ever was.
And I suppose it's just, when you look back at old photographs, I was ready to be a priest myself one time, but when you look back at old photographs of Maynooth and all of that, and now come along the circle today, where there's a huge shortage of priests, the whole nature of the religion itself, the Roman Catholic religion, is changing fundamentally. Well, it has to change because of the fact that you don't have a priest available to you now as they were, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's not a problem now. For instance, in Dublin, where there's a million people, really, it's a problem, David, around Dublin. I know it's a problem down in the countryside, all right,
Well, there's 3 parishes in my area, and they have, I think, 1 to 2 priests serving each one, whereas once upon a time there would have been 3 each. So there might be 5 between the 6 of them now rather than 9. I could be wrong about that, but that's roughly what it is. But that's going to change an awful lot in the next 10 years. And in the end, it could be 2 between 3 and then 1 between 3. And then even worse. I think at present in Dublin Diocese, there is nobody training for the priesthood at all, which is simply amazing. Yeah, I think there's no one, but it's simply amazing. So we're going to have something absolutely transformed, and we're going to have to bring priests in from abroad. I mean, Ireland for so many years sent priests and nuns abroad, so we're going to have to accept more priests and nuns from overseas because we're going to become mission territory. And they say there must be more lay involvement, but it's absolutely true. But the laity are getting older too.
Yeah.
So so we're facing a major problem. But and there's now, this is only cold comfort. You look at other organizations within society, and so political parties, their members are getting older and fewer in general. Probably Sinn Féin is the exception. But Fine Gael members becoming fewer, getting older. Fianna Fáil very much the same. Members of trade unions getting older, and this is public sector unions. Newspaper readers are getting older and fewer. There's fewer people getting married than used to be the case. So this kind of phenomenon of aging is not just affecting the church, and actually it's affecting society as a whole, because our society is getting older, Western society is getting older, people are having fewer children, people are getting married later if they get married at all. I think there's a generalized crisis of institutional belonging. I think we've become so individualistic we don't like to join things anymore. And that means things that might make demands on us, like religion. Marriage makes demands on us. Getting politically involved even can make demands on us. So we just don't want things that are going to encumber us or take away our freedom. And of course, having children is a big one. I mean, there's nothing that takes away your freedom more than having children, is there?
If anything did. No, it's all right, lads. I still love you all, grandchildren and all.
You sign on the dotted line when you have your first child, and you live for others then completely.
But really, this ethos, this thing that was engendered in us going to school with a subject called civics, this civic duty, this idea of service to the state. I mean, this vocation of service, whether it's to the state or whether it's to an organization, to a community, this, as you said, is completely shattered today.
But increasingly, yeah. I mean, you still see it in the GAA, so it's still there. I mean, the GAA is an absolutely flourishing organization, as you know, huge participation and volunteerism. But it's probably the last best example of that, really, that you see. And on the Sunday morning, if I'm walking in the local park, you see all the kids there playing GAA, and you kind of look at this and you're thinking, GAA grew up out of the parish structure. And now there we are, and all the young people are going to GAA practice on the Sunday morning. So it's kind of ironic that the thing that grew out of the parish structure is now doing this on a Sunday morning. And I think it's kind of a bit of a comment on what's happened in society. But that's, anyway, as I say, the GAA is the last best example of a hugely flourishing volunteer organization. It's kind of an echo in a way, because again, there's been a disengagement, generally speaking, from organizations that make demands. And as I say, including marriage, we have, I think, the lowest percentage of people married ever in Ireland now, at least since we began to record these things. And so marriage is obviously both hugely rewarding and hugely demanding. And so we see fewer and fewer people getting married, and say fewer and fewer people having children. But I think the crisis of kind of participation and commitment within the church, and the vocations crisis and the aging of the cohorts going to mass, is a reflection, again, of what's happening in Western societies generally, which is to say getting much older, fewer children, less belonging. So Western society itself, probably in terms of how it's aging and declining, is only about 20 or 30 years behind the church. I think the church was first hit by this phenomenon of disengagement and aging, but I think it's very much happening to Western societies as well. So I think if you go forward a few decades, what you're going to find that the sun is kind of setting on Western societies will be transformed by immigration. Some of these immigrants are going to come from much more Christian areas like Nigeria and the Philippines. And I think that's how we'll begin to transform again. This will be after our lifetimes, but I would say that's what's going to happen. I sort of a miracle, which you can never rule out, obviously. I don't think we'll see a religious revival among Irish people or people in the West for the foreseeable future. So I think a revival is most likely to come from the outside.
And David, before we finish, you were editor for many, many years of the Irish Catholic. How's the distribution? How is that distributed? Is it through the churches or through the parish system, or what way do people
get? So I was editor of the Irish Catholic from 1996 until 2003. So yeah, almost entirely through churches. So I still write a column for the Irish Catholic, and its main distribution is still through churches, which of course, when the churches have been closed for so much, and there's still a lot of people not gone back to Mass, it's obviously suffered. So obviously I hope it gets through this whole period. Yeah, I mean, it's not a good time for newspapers. It's not a good time for Catholic newspapers. It's a kind of battle for survival, and it's been there since 1888. Hopefully it'll be there for many decades to come.
It's a tough one, and some more retail places should take it, really, because I mean, all viewpoints are relevant,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, some retail places do take it, and it does its best to get into these places. Yeah, so we see what the future holds, but it's the same question for other newspapers, because local papers are in trouble.
Yeah,
national newspapers are in trouble.
Yeah.
Fast forward a few decades, will we have all the national titles we have now? We certainly won't. There's so much is going online. People expect things to be free. So, yeah, it's not a good time for newspapers overall.
So, David, you have a regular column on the Sunday Times, Sunday Times Ireland edition. Is that what you call it?
That's correct, yeah.
Sunday Times Ireland edition. Do you enjoy that? Are you free to say what you like in that column?
I am. Yeah, completely.
Laws now and all of this.
Yeah, no, there'll be no editorial interference. I mean, obviously, they want to make sure that you got all your facts right. So that's what.
Yeah.
That's fine. But no, I mean, it's a great discipline writing a column. So 2 columns a week, because your mind is always kind of ticking over, and you're looking for the next thing to write about, and you're making sure you keep up with events. And so I've been doing it now for 27 years. So hopefully there's a few more years left to be doing that kind of thing. And you see as well, there's a lot of consensus within the Irish media. So I think it becomes more important to have a few voices out there within the mainstream media which are trying to say something different on a range of issues. It becomes more important, not less, the tighter and stricter the consensus becomes.
Well, David, it's been an absolute pleasure. The hour went flying. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It was our first time having you on LiR Confidential with us here on LiR Media. We're based in Limerick City. Our studios are down here in Limerick City, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future, in a couple of weeks' time. Are you optimistic for the immediate future?
You mean the next few weeks?
Yeah.
Apprehensive. I don't know what they're going to do about restrictions. Yeah, apprehensive.
Well, hopefully Santi will be able to move around after 12 o'clock. That's a lot of people worried about.
They won't stop him.
Anyway, David, for this edition of LiR Confidential, for myself, Papa, and all the gang here, we really appreciate your time. And until we meet again, David, take care, goodbye, and God bless.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.